these truths to be self-evident.
That all men are created equal.
As a member of Congress, I get to have a lot of really interesting people in the office, experts on what they're talking about.
This is the podcast
For insights into the issues.
China, bioterrorism, Medicare for all, in-depth discussions.
Breaking it down into simple terms. We hold
these truths
with Dan Crenshaw.
The Eagle has landed.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, I want to have a great conversation about Western civilization. We have quite the guest to do just that. We're joined by Joseph Loconte. And I want to have this conversation because we've seen in recent history as many universities are ditching teaching Western civilization in favor of other worthless woke topics like gender studies and whatnot. And there's even some on the right-wing populist side that I think question America's founding principles and question what conservatism is even about. Just today, there was well-known conservative commentators, I'll just say her name, it's Molly Hemingway, claiming on social media that our own intelligence community is actually more of a threat than Russia. Okay. So look, there's a lot of problems here. There's a lot of emotion. There's a lot of claims that are just devoid of evidence or just logic. And I think it's deeply rooted in an intense resentment that is spreading, not just for our political institutions, but our society at large. This idea that America itself is corrupt. I definitely noticed that both political parties believe that America is just a worse place if the other guy is in charge. And that didn't always used to be the case with at least Republicans, but it certainly seems to be the case now, just based on what I hear. It's a problem. And I want to know if we can rescue ourselves from that deep cynicism and pessimism. And I think looking to history and Western civilization teachings might be helpful. So Joseph, thanks for being on. I'll say a little bit about you before we start. He's a presidential scholar in residence at New College of Florida and the C.S. Lewis Scholar for Public Life at Grove City College. He served as a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, A Hobbit, A Wardrobe, and A Great War, How J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis rediscovered faith, friendship, and heroism in the cataclysm of 1914 to 1918. And also worked as an associate professor of history at the King's College in New York City and distinguished visiting professor at the School of Public Policy at Pepperdine University. Got a few other books you're free to mention as we talk, but let's just dive into it. You've also testified before Congress before.
Yes, I have.
Some time ago. Well, I'm sure that was a fun experience. And you've also been an advisor to the White House on faith-based initiatives under Bush, it sounds like. And
Right.
there's a huge bio here. So appreciate you being on, Joseph. I mean, where do we begin? I kind of want to begin with a little bit of a reminder of, if you had to give a course in Western civilization in, just a few minutes, what are some of the big ideas that
Yeah.
people need to be aware of if somebody wanted to, in layman's terms, just describe to their friends, look, this is what I mean by Western civilization. What would
Yeah.
you say?
Terrific. And thank you for having me, Congressman. It's an incredibly important conversation I think we're going to have here. What's Western Civ? Go back to the Greeks and the Romans. Greek and Roman culture, that classical culture, transformed by Judaism and Christianity, the Judeo-Christian outlook, transformed again by what? You could argue the revolutions in the 16th and 17th centuries, the technological, scientific revolutions, political revolutions in those centuries. And then geographically, we're talking more or less Europe, of course, the United States, North America. We'll throw in the Canadians, our gentle neighbors to the north. But yeah, that's the idea, this classical biblical tradition, which has been profoundly influenced by the scientific and political revolutions of the 17th and 18th century. So what's important about that for us right now? What ideals, institutions came out of Western Civ uniquely? Well, things like government by consent of the governed, separation of powers, political freedom, political equality, religious freedom. All of these ideas really were unique to the whole Western tradition. And I think the danger we have right now is there's such an amnesia, such an ignorance of the history, such an ignorance of that cultural inheritance, Congressman, that we don't understand what it requires to preserve that, to transmit it, to pass it on. There's a thin line between civilization and barbarism, right? And we're seeing that thin line just melt away, of course, in many of our urban areas where I live, back in Washington, D.C. especially. So yeah, there's an amazing inheritance we have from the West, with all of our problems, with all of our difficulties, with all the black spots in our record. I get that. I teach that history. I understand the dark side of Western civ. I get it. But boy, the contribution to human dignity and human flourishing out of Western civilization, it's remarkable. And we got to hang on to it.
Yeah, and so maybe we go into it in a little bit more detail. So you named a few, I think, principles that came out of centuries, thousands of years, really, of history. Separation of powers. This idea that every human is imbued with some kind of value, sort of a divine right to or natural rights. Life, liberty, property, or life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, however you want to describe it.
Yes.
But that all came, I think, step by step. And one of my favorite observations, it's a Russell Kirk observation that, we had all these great ideas from throughout thousands of years of history, from Jerusalem to Rome to Athens to London. And they were just, and we finally wrote them down in Philadelphia all at once. and we can bash America all we want, but it's like, it's still the best place to be. And we've had a pretty remarkably stable constitutional framework for being a young country. It's still the oldest constitution.
Yes.
So, so if we phrase it like that, I mean, what did we first get from Jerusalem, and then Athens, and then Rome? How would you say we learned our lessons over time?
Yeah, terrific. And I want to emphasize that point you just made, Congressman, learning the lessons.
Just call me
quickly
Dan.
on this
Just call me
point.
Dan.
Yeah.
Please.
All right, Dan. Sure, Dan. The American founders were so deliberate about the founding, about the Constitution, and they learned the lessons of history. To borrow from my friend Os Guinness, the great social thinker Os Guinness, they learned from history in order to defy history, right? Use the lessons of history to defy history, meaning the natural drift of things is decay, deterioration, degeneration, right? You got to push back. So what do we get from the Greeks and the Romans and then onward? Just kind of, a headline version of this. The amazing thing about the Greeks, for all their problems, was, okay, power, kratos, belongs to the people, the demos. They call it demokratia, democracy, government by consent. You're getting that idea of government by consent from the Greeks. It will collapse into factions, mass mob democracy, mobocracy. But we get, instead of direct democracy, it becomes mobocracy, and it all collapses. The Romans pick up on this idea, though, of government by consent, and they found not a democracy, but a republic, a representative body, the Senate. They have councils sharing power, separation of powers. You're getting that in ancient Rome, but that idea of a republic, not a democracy. To borrow ideas from the Greeks, they're going to take it the next step. But the other things the Romans give us, especially through Cicero, is natural law. You mentioned natural rights a minute ago. You don't get natural rights, the rights we articulate in our Constitution and the Declaration. You don't get that without natural law. This idea that there's a universal moral law, unchangeable, applies to everybody across the globe. That goes back to Cicero.
Yeah.
And that's kind of amazing, articulating natural law, right?
Yeah, it is. It's funny. I was just reading up on a book that on Cicero's book, how to run a government, or how to run a state, or forget the exact title, but one of many writings, and he talks about this sort of the self-evident natural law, which is of course what our founders wrote in our Declaration of Independence, about something that is self-evident. How did they? I mean, we have our own ways of describing a republic versus a democracy, right? It's popular on the conservative side to say we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And, but it's important to flesh that out a little bit, what we mean by that. And then how exactly did the Greeks govern? Forgive my, it has been a while since my Western Civ
no, that's fine.
class, I suppose. So did they literally govern with a pure democracy? So if there's an issue at hand, it was just a vote to the public, whereas, whereas there's representation in Rome and in the Senate. And you imbue that representative with decision-making powers. Maybe let's get into a little detail on what the differences were.
It's worth doing. It's worth doing because the founders learned from this, and it's worth doing. So what do you have in ancient Greece? If you're a citizen, and not everybody's a citizen, obviously, slaves aren't citizens, women don't get rights of citizenship. But if you're born in Greece and you're a male, you're a citizen, and you're expected to show up at the Acropolis in Athens and vote. maybe 5,000 guys would do that out of a population of maybe 50,000 or so in Athens. 5,000 going to show up, and they're going to debate the issues of the day, the domestic policy issues, whether or not to go to war. You're going to cast your vote directly.
Wow.
That's mass direct democracy, and that is literally what they did.
As direct as
And
you
no
can
one
get.
else in the world is doing it. It's an astonishing thing. For some reason, Dan, the Greeks get it in their heads. We're meant to live in freedom, not be ruled by dictators, kings, and pharaohs. How they got that idea is still a mystery, from historians. But there it was. It took root there, right? Rome learns from that. That turns into factions, tribalism. Athens goes against Sparta, the Peloponnesian War. It's a big disaster. It ends badly. But then the Romans learn from that. And they say, okay, wait a minute. We don't want direct democracy, but we want democratic elements. So what is the Senate in Rome? Not everybody's a senator once again, right? But it is a lifetime appointment. If you are a citizen, you can become a senator. So maybe there's 300, 400, 500 or so senators right there arguing, Cicero giving his speeches on the floor of the Senate. And that becomes really the most important political body in Rome. You have these other guys alongside the two consuls, guys who are kind of sharing power, like a president and a vice president. But if they ignore the advice of the Senate, that's going to be a problem. So it's a representative body for the rest of the Roman Empire.
And they represented regions of the Roman Empire, just as we represent regions in Congress, or how did they do it exactly?
They theoretically represent the entire Roman Republic before it became an empire. And that's one of the tragedies of ancient Rome. It went from a republic with a real limitations on power.
Right.
And then it just degenerates into autocracy, tyranny, civil wars, an empire, and all the rest of it. But at its peak, the golden age of the Republic, just as Cicero was realizing things are going south, about 100 years before Cicero, he's watching things happening. They've got this representative body that holds in check the worst impulses of the populace.
Well,
I'm making governing decisions.
No, I'm just asking, like, how does a senator become a senator? Did they literally have an election? These are very basic questions, but I don't think we all know.
Now, if you're a Roman citizen and you're of age, which would have been, I guess, at that time, about 18, 19, 20, right to whenever, you are eligible to be in the Senate, and so you'll be advised by another senator. You'll be invited in, and you'll serve a life term as a senator. So you've got technically a large number of senators representing the Republic, but only a certain number could be there at one time.
Okay, but the people don't. There wasn't like a democratic process to elect the senators as representatives. And
correct.
And so I wonder if that was maybe one of the problems. So they didn't really take too many lessons from the democratic, the pure democracy of Athens. They said that doesn't work. That's too chaotic. But maybe if we have a larger body of people deliberating, it'll be, somewhat the will of the people and also more stable. I guess the problem is there was no will of the people. And so it's kind of not that surprising, I guess, that it devolved into sort of the dictatorship that it did. And I wonder if that's obviously something our founders looked at carefully.
Yeah, they did, because you had the problem of factions, as you know, Dan. This becomes a huge topic in the Federalist Papers. Madison and the guys, they realize this is the mortal disease of self-government, factions, and it will bring down the Roman Republic as it brought down the Greek democracies as well. Different families, powerful families, landowners, fighting amongst themselves or pushing out the middle class, the artisans, the tradesmen who don't have the voice they want to have. So there are all kinds of competing interests, of course, in either a large republic or an empire. How are you going to manage those interests? Challenging, absolutely challenging.
Challenging, yeah, especially if there's we've built in a lot of sort of pressure release valves into our system that they simply didn't have, but we learned from. But backing up, though, I mean, so how about the theory? Where did Greece get this idea that regular people could have a say in something, right? Where they get, that's interesting. And I think, I think, like, when Russell Kirk talks about Jerusalem, he's talking more about what did we get from Jerusalem? I mean, he's talking about the birth of Christianity. He's talking about this, and he's talking about a moral framework, a Judeo-Christian moral framework, which is important for Western civilization, because whether you're an atheist or not an atheist, you're still abiding by what could be considered a Judeo-Christian moral framework, right? The 10 Commandments
Yeah.
make sense to you whether you believe in God or not.
Yes.
And the other, interesting theory. I read a book on it's called maybe The Birth of Individualism or something. I can't remember who wrote it, but it was pretty decent. It was probably too much detail, so I never really got quite all the way through it. But the basic lesson was, the interesting thing about Christianity was it was the first time that every individual was given power over their own religion. Because if you look to kind of Old Testament side, you look to old Jewish practices, your access to God was through priests or elders. It was not through your own, heart. It wasn't through your own prayer. And that was
Yes.
the interesting revolution that Jesus, brought to the world, and that everybody gets to access God. So it's like it's the biggest statement on equality in history. And
Yes.
I wonder if, but did that really influence the Greeks at the time? My history isn't perfect on that, and because we're talking about Greek history that predates Jesus, so right, so that
Yeah.
can't be where they got it from. But it is, but
Right.
at least it's important for our context and what we believe.
Yeah. Yeah, Dan. And it's hard sometimes to know how the borrowing process, politically speaking, but borrowing, you're absolutely right, though, when you say what the Christian faith introduces into the bloodstream of the West is a universalism and a human equality that was simply not known in the ancient world, period. A universalism and a human equality, right? And we were just talking about this in my class today, actually, in my Western Civ class over here at New College. This idea, this message from Jesus for God, a verse that a Bible verse a lot of people know, for God so loved the world that he gave his
Mhm.
only begotten son, that whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. It's an open invitation. And in that culture in Rome in the first century, think about that. A chunk of the population are slaves. Most people are not citizens, don't have access to political power. Here's a message of the universal, indiscriminate love of God, no matter who you are, no matter what your background, race, gender, it doesn't matter. You put your trust in Jesus and you have eternal life. That's a radical message of human equality, if you think about it, right?
Yeah, no, it is, and it's an important part to understand about how we think about it and how our founders thought about it. Okay, so let's move on. So our founders are watching. Well, they're reading their history on Athens and Greek history, and then okay, that didn't work out exactly how they wanted it to. So how did the Romans do it? Okay, well, that didn't exactly work out either. These experiments keep defaulting to despotism and
That's
anarchy,
right.
or
That's right.
just or brutal dictatorship. And so okay, so they move their sights to medieval Europe and Renaissance era Europe. What are they learning?
Well, that's a terrific question. Think about what happens when the Roman Empire falls, right? 5th, 6th century, in decay, Roman Empire collapses. Who's left standing? Well, what's left standing? It's the Christian church. And this is where the Catholic Church plays a really important role, and the monks play a hugely important role in keeping the flame of civilization burning when it's
Yeah.
pretty dark outside of the borders of the Roman Empire, right? So the value of education, the value of literacy, the value of work, the importance of some relationship between church and state in which the state is trying to uphold these basic moral truths and basic moral ideas. Now, things go off the rails. You could certainly argue as you get into the Middle and later Middle Ages in the church-state relationship and the power struggles. And then ultimately,
Mhm.
Dan, of course, the corruption, the absolute utter corruption of the papacy. We got to be frank about it. One of the things the founders learned was coming out of the whole European context was, hey, wait a minute. Mixing church and state the way you've been mixing it is a bad idea. It's been tried and it's failed. It led to all kinds of corruption and then ultimately religious
Right.
wars. Let's separate those two institutions of church and state institutionally.
And it's a
Separate.
bad
One of the huge
idea.
lessons.
And it's a bad idea because, I'm going to make an assumption here, but I'd love to hear your answer. Why is it a bad idea? And I assume because what it does is it imbues some sort of divine power into what is nothing more than a human being who happens to be a king, right? And that just creates, it just invites that kind of corruption and abuse of power.
Yes, that's certainly, Dan, a huge part of the answer, the divine right of kings theory. But also on the other side, on the church side, As soon as you have a government that says, okay, this is the accepted official religion, this is the favored religion, then if you don't buy into that religious creed, you're on the outs. And so your resistance or rebellion against the national church, it becomes a political rebellion. And now you're seditious. I'm a John Locke scholar as well. And to me, this is one of Locke's great contributions to the Western liberal tradition, is to understanding as soon as you have a national church, you're going to have all of these losers, the people who are on the outs, and their civil and political and religious liberties will be trampled. That's the pattern. That's the historical pattern, right, Dan?
Yeah.
And
And,
to
let's-
your
and,
earlier
we'll-
point,
and don't worry, I'm going to get to Locke because I know you're a Locke scholar, but he's like, 17th, 18th century here. So, we've got a long way to go, I think.
we got wait,
but,
right.
but what else were you going to say there? I cut you off.
No, I was just going to say that. No, you didn't cut me off at all. That this pattern of kind of church-state partnership, if you will, and then feuding back and forth, it is an uncomfortable fact for all the achievements of Christendom, with the Catholic Church so dominant, all the wonderful cultural achievements, and they are immense and they are impressive in bringing what had been really a barbaric, corrupt, degenerate Roman Empire and civilizing it and Christianizing it. It's an incredible achievement, but things do go south, and they will go south in part because of the church-state relationship issue.
Yeah. And in the end, the religion is religion. The Bible is the Bible. It's the men are still men. And so like, as Christians, we always find ourselves, debating the authority of Christianity with, non-believers, or especially those on the left who are just trying to discredit it. And then they'll point to examples like that, right? Where there was massive corruption, where there is that intolerance. Well, how can you say you live by these? How can you stand by a church when they do these things? And how do you answer? How do you answer that?
Well, look, part of what I have to say is let's think about some of the amazing things, achievements that we take for granted now in the modern world. It's a debt that we owe to Christendom. And well, let's just take one obvious one, maybe not so obvious to people outside of your listening view here, Dan, out of your audience, the scientific revolution. The narrative we hear from the left is how we got the scientific revolution was we finally cast off all the religious superstition. We became rational. We got rid of the boogeyman of religion, and in came the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. Absolutely not the case historically. We got a scientific revolution. You think about those early scientists, Kepler, Newton, Galileo, and the gang. They are all either deeply committed Christian men, or they're certainly their worldview is consistent with a biblical understanding of a creator separate from his creation, an intelligent, purposeful creator, right? We can study the natural world. One of the mottos of those early scientists was, God has written two books, the book of scripture and the book of nature, right? And that's not inconsistent at all with the scientific pursuit of truth. Isaac Newton, deeply involved in the scripture and his own commentaries on the Bible. Newton said this, Plato is my friend and Aristotle is my friend, but my greatest friend is truth. So a commitment to Christianity, to biblical religion, was not inconsistent at all with the pursuit of scientific truth. In fact, the one fed the other. There'd be no scientific revolution in the West without Christianity, period. That's a debt. That's a great debt that we owe, despite all the shenanigans going on at the time, that you could argue, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was because it was a mixed bag, right? I mean, because you obviously had some clergy that were completely against it, just like we have today. I mean, nothing's changed.
That's right.
That's right. But what's more interesting about today, this is totally a separate conversation to have, but I've had it on this podcast before, is how closer and closer I think science is bringing us to God. When you think about astrophysics, theoretical physics, particle physics, evolutionary theory, kind of, I think being massively debunked as a creationism, or as a creation theory. We've had those conversations with some interesting people here on the podcast, and it's just, there doesn't need to be this divide between science and religion, I think, is the ultimate point. Okay, so we continue down history, and eventually we arrive at some sort of some sort of like free market ideals, right? This idea that societies have always traded with each other. That's always been a thing. But, Dark Ages, medieval Europe, largely feudal systems. I mean, where did that start to begin? Where does our understanding of capitalism and property rights start to bubble up?
Fabulous question. I want to take it back a bit here, Dan, in that the idea of protection of private property, this is a deeply rooted value in the West. You go back to some of the oldest legal codes, and we just did this in my Western Civ class. Go back to the oldest legal codes in Greece or in Rome. The code that the Romans had, protection of private property and penalties if you violate another guy's property. And it seems to me what the Jewish and Christian traditions do is they strengthen that commitment. They deepen that commitment because, and we'll get to Locke eventually, I know, but the idea of property is going to take on a broader meaning in the West, not just your physical property, what you own, but even your intellectual property, right?
Your labor, your time. Yeah,
that's right. Your creative abilities, the things that you're creating, using your imagination, using your hard thinking, not only the sweat of your brow, but what's going on in your brain and what you're creating, a broad view of property. And I think this goes back to this Judeo-Christian understanding of the human person, that there's a fundamental dignity and worth here. And so when that person produces something, it's an image of what God himself does. He creates, right? That's a deeply rooted biblical idea. We create in a fruitful way, just as God creates, as an intimation of what the creator does, right?
Right. And there's this, again, like sort of this natural right element there where you were allowed to protect that. Okay. And so moving on, our founders also referenced English common law quite a bit. And, we had some interesting, in-depth research on this as we just impeached Mayorkas, because there's a really interesting debate about what impeachment is for. And, our founders debated that. We continue to debate it to this day. That's an interesting conversation if we want to have it, but, tell us about how they were British, right? They were British subjects who decided to rebel and become just Americans. And, and so they know the British system, and it's important to note, not everything from the British system was bad. They took parts of it they liked. So what were the main elements there?
Yeah, it's a great question to ask, Dan, and we need to think about this as Americans. And when I did my academic work on John Locke, 17th century thinker, I came away really deeply encouraged by the debt that we owe, the intellectual and even spiritual debt that we owe to the Brits. So what did we get from the Brits? The Americans are claiming their rights as Englishmen in the rebellion. Their rights as Englishmen. They've got the Magna Carta behind them. They've got the English Bill of Rights, which helps establish the constitutional monarchy, limits the power of the king.
Can we say what both? Can we explain to the audience what both of those are before we move on?
Yeah.
Too much?
Well, think about that Magna Carta in the 1200s. Basically says nobody's above the law, right? Laying out some basic things about you can't just be arrested without any cause. You need just cause for arrest. So we're limiting the power of the sovereign right from the Magna Carta. And the English Bill of Rights in the British Glorious Revolution in 1689. That's kind of one of their big sort of founding documents, if you will.
Right.
What are they saying? They're limiting the power of the monarchy. They're making the parliament reinforcing the power and the say of the English parliament as representing the people, right? Government by consent. They're reaffirming that principle of government by consent against dictatorship, against kings, divine right of kings. They're throwing it away in the English Bill of Rights, and some measure of religious toleration as well, which was new in Great Britain. So it's an important document. The Americans are claiming all of that as their own. But the other thing they're claiming, Dan, which is really important, is natural rights. Natural rights came out of the debates in the 17th century in Great Britain. And this was mostly the Protestants who are arguing this way. The Catholics will come in later. But in the 17th century, it's dissenting Protestants. In other words, if you're not a member of the Church of England, you might be a Baptist, you might be a Quaker, you might be an independent guy who can't not go to the Church of England, and you are fighting for the rights of conscience. So you can't separate the debates between political freedom and religious freedom in the 17th century. They are joined at the hip. And the Americans have taken a lot. They'll take a lot from that They will just run with it. The principle of freedom of conscience, the Americans going to run with in a way that the Brits weren't prepared to do.
Right. This idea of freedom of religion. And let's sidetrack a little bit because it gets into an interesting debate that is often had about separation of church and state. And so sometimes, and there's different interpretations of that. What is the right interpretation that our founders understood to be separation of church and state? Because they were obviously religious. They referenced the Bible more than any other document when in their writings, as they debated and everything. It was just well understood that there is a creator, and I mean it's literally in our founding documents. So it's not like they wanted to separate it completely. I think what they meant was you should have the freedom of religion. There shall be no state religion. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, and I've learned a lot from my good friend Os Guinness on this, and of course other readings. But think about the First Amendment. Congress will pass no law respecting an establishment of religion, nor prohibiting the free exercise thereof. 2 clauses, Dan. 2 clauses with a single overriding purpose. What's the purpose? Protect freedom of conscience. Protect religious liberty. Now, why? I think the founders saw what John Locke saw. If you don't protect freedom of conscience, religious freedom, then all the other freedoms are at risk. Think about it. Why do you want the right to speak, free speech, free press, right of assembly, right of association? Because you've got something to say. You've got a conscience. You have a set of convictions. If those aren't protected in law as the fundamental freedom, then the other freedoms are at risk. That's, I think, part of the genius of the American experiment, putting it front and center in the Bill of Rights.
So let's go into Locke a little bit. I mean, what kind of world was he living in that he felt he needed to write some of these more famous writings, the 2 treatises of government, especially those, and famously make these declarations about freedom of conscience, the importance of human freedom, and this sort of idea of natural rights with life, liberty, and property. Which our founders turned into life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, which is an interesting conversation as to why they did that. But what was he living in? And what if I'm also curious, like, what's the counterfactual? What if Locke just was never around? Do you think these ideas would have come to be some other way? He was massively influential in our founders.
He was, actually. Thanks for that question, Dan. It's a big one. Let me take a stab at it. What's going on from, say, 1660 to about 1689 when Locke is most active? But just stop and think for a minute. Just before you get to 1660, Britain has had its own civil war. You had a fight between the king and the parliament, right? It's a bloody civil war. They actually abolished the monarchy for a time, literally abolished the monarchy, and they got rid of the state church. They abolished the national church, the Anglican church. In 1660, with all the chaos, they reestablish it. So it's called the Restoration. We restore the monarchy. We restore the Church of England. You think things are going to be okay. They're not. What begins now in 1660 is this sort of frenetic attempt to get people to conform to the new national church, the Anglican church, and get on board with the political agenda. Locke is living through that period as the government is becoming more restrictive, clamping down on people's political and religious liberties to force people into the Church of England. It's just leading to all kinds of civil strife. And you'll have another challenge again by the 1670s, 1680s. The king, Charles I, and then Charles II, and then James. These guys want to challenge the authority of Parliament. They want to get their own way. It's a power struggle, not a civil war, but it's a real power struggle. So Locke is caught up in a time, Dan, put it this way. Political absolutism, think Hobbes, right? And the Leviathan. Political absolutism and religious absolutism or religious authority or authoritarianism, they go hand in hand. They are joined at the hip in the 17th century in Great Britain. They're joined at the hip in France, Catholic France, under Louis XIV, the absolute monarch, the Sun King. Right? So Locke has to deal with both problems. He's got to deal with political absolutism and he's got to deal with religious absolutism. So he gives us these 2 really remarkable documents, the 2 treatises on government and his letter concerning toleration, to say, wait a minute, let's establish some principles. What is government about? The fundamental purpose of government. Locke articulates that in a way no one else had done. its job is to protect our natural rights. What are our natural rights? Life, liberty, property. Life, liberty, property. And a government that fails to protect those natural rights is no longer legitimate, and you have a right to revolt. No one else had articulated in such a powerful way as Locke did, especially in the second treatise. So that is a huge thing. That's the cultural environment he's in, political environment he's in. It's deeply contentious, and there's a lot of repression. It's an incredibly violent time in Great Britain's history.
Yeah, and this is referred to as he's Scottish, John Locke, right?
He's not Scottish. He's English.
He's not.
He's
not.
He's
Okay.
not a Scot. He's English. He's a member of the Church of England.
I thought he was Scottish. Okay. But there's so when people refer to the Scottish Enlightenment as I think the more American Enlightenment, really, there's multiple Enlightenments happening. Maybe flesh that out for us.
Yeah, Locke is part of the early English Enlightenment, but it's an Enlightenment that is not hostile to religion. The French Enlightenment, Dan, as you probably know, which is one of the reasons I like to pick on the French, not only because they're French, is that the Enlightenment in France was deeply anti-religious, not just anti-Catholic, but anti-Christian, anti-biblical, right? The de-Christianization program of the French Enlightenment guys. Nothing like that's happening in Great Britain, and certainly nothing like that in the United States. So the British Enlightenment emphasizes virtue, emphasizes morality. It's friendly to Christian faith, and there's a huge emphasis on individual rights, right?
Yeah.
That's on the English side. The American, through the Scots, you're right, though. The Scots have a huge thing on this. Through that Scottish Enlightenment, on the American side, you could argue that the Americans, what do we bring to the table on the Enlightenment? I think we probably bring not only republicanism, small r, representative government into the Enlightenment in a big way. We also bring, you could argue, Christianity. In the American context, Protestant Christianity predominantly. That's one of the streams, two of the streams that enter into our Enlightenment: republicanism, right?
Yeah.
Natural rights, and Protestant Christianity help really shape the American Enlightenment in a way that's not true so much in Great Britain, certainly not in France.
Did they? So there was a lot of debate over what kind of Congress we would have, whether it would be like a parliamentary system, the way the British had, or a bicameral system with the Congress and a House and a Senate, the way we do have, and the way they ultimately decided upon. And that to me makes logical sense why you decide upon that, because if you have just the House, well, I think you're still subject to the whims of the mob. I mean, and I see it in the House all the time. I live here. All right. It's emotional. You're up for office or up for re-election every 2 years. And it's very easy to get people to even say and do things I don't think they believe. Whereas the Senate's supposed to be a different, at least a different body, where something also has to pass. But I'm not actually sure. Did they reference that idea from another government? I'm not aware of it.
Well, they certainly studied other systems. Not only the Greeks and the Romans, they studied some of the republics, the Italian Republic, city-states, Florence, Venice, and what happened there. How did they govern? But the big challenge for the founders, of course, Dan, was, okay, we've got this vast republic, this vast geographical space. One chamber ain't going to cut it. So we need a more representative body, like a House of Representatives, but we also need a Senate that thinks more in the national terms. And that's kind of the genius. That was one of the great compromises, really, going into the convention.
I guess my question is that bicameral Congress an American first idea? Like, was that our idea first, or was that something they looked at? Because I don't know. I mean, I don't know of any other government that did that.
Well, the Brits, of course, had a House of Lords and a House of Commons.
They have a House of Lords. Yeah, right. That's true.
So it's out there. It's out there. But the Americans are going to, of course, put their own spin on it, right?
Right. Yeah. The House of Lords is it is not an elected body. It's you get there through your noble lineage. It's still that way, by the way.
Yeah.
And our Senate
it's permanent.
was,
yeah, you're a permanent member, right?
And our Senate, our first senators, at least before the Constitution changed, were elected by state legislatures. So it was meant to represent the state. I think we should. I don't know what you think. I think that was a better system. Until making it a popular vote, I think basically creates, over time, it's taken some time, but it's getting there, has basically created two houses. that are, that they're not quite the same, but
Mhm.
they're more similar than I think the founders intended them to be. I
Hmm.
don't know. What do you think about that?
I think you're probably right, Dan. I don't know what the answer is. I'm not a political scientist. I'm leaning more and more toward term limits, though. I can tell you that emotionally
It's
for the
emotional.
senators.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. No, I always remind people like, hey, they're like, well, I want to get rid of Nancy Pelosi. I'm like, she represents San Francisco. Who do you think's going to replace Nancy Pelosi? It's going to be
Right.
some like
Right.
crazy blue haired, lady who identifies as a dolphin on Thursdays. Like that's who's going to replace her. So I'm not sure you're getting a whole lot of a better deal there. The term limits is a whole other discussion, but okay. So I love kind of going through this history and reminding myself and others sort of where we came from and why we do things the way we do. I just think it's fascinating. Now let's talk. Maybe more modern politics. So you have these Lockean principles. Our founders were deeply, I guess, impressed by them, influenced by them. Uh, I think it's obvious that the left has always been, well, not always, but certainly the Marxist left, which is a maybe more recent phenomenon in the last century, has been decently suspect of those principles for a variety of reasons. We can talk about that, and then what is their issue with those principles fundamentally, you think, and how that manifests in our modern debates, and then we'll move on to the I think the more recent phenomenon where the more populist right, I think, also doesn't agree
Yeah.
with a lot of these principles.
Yeah. That's a fascinating question, Dan. You've asked me what's the fundamental grievance or grievances that the left has with our liberal democratic order.
Hmm.
Boys, a lot you can put on the table. I guess they would look at the liberal democratic order and say, well, inequalities all around, too much inequality, whether that's in an economic sense or in a political sense. We're not getting the level playing field that we want.
Right.
And so the idea of merit, hard work, merit, a meritocracy, it
Yeah.
seems to have become anathema to the left. But it
Right.
was so important to the founding generation. And think about what the Americans did. It was anti-elitist in so many ways. I understand the racism right from the beginning. Believe me, I get that. I understand the residual elitism. But if you think about it, what the Americans are going after is that whole class structure that was so dominant in Great Britain. The ordinary farmer can make a go at it, can make a run, can enter into a political life in an amazing way, with an echo of ancient Greece, you could argue. A person with no particular inheritance rights or anything could really become a prominent citizen. And we have all kinds of examples, of course, of that in our history. The left is not comfortable with that because it focuses so much on the people who seem to be left out for whatever reason, right? So
Yeah.
meritocracy is one of them. But I think the other thing the left really despises right now, which is so deeply troubling, is, well, what about the whole concept of natural rights? Natural, inalienable rights by virtue of being human. And I think that concept now is, it is anathema. It's not putting it too strongly that the left cannot come to the conclusion and agree, yeah, there are certain inalienable rights that come from the hand of God that we just don't mess with by virtue of being a human being. It doesn't seem to me that the radical left believes that anymore, if they ever did, right?
Right. Well, see, and especially, that radical Marxist left, because their end goal is this sort of egalitarianism. And by definition, you've got to infringe on somebody's natural rights in order to force equality, like perfect equality. So
That's
of course, of course they throw out those principles. And I think the other thing is they're at their heart, there's like the really bad, crazy progressive stuff. And then there's sort of your kind-hearted liberals. Like there's different categories.
Yeah.
And I think
Absolutely.
your kind-hearted liberal is just a utopianist. And I think,
Yes.
which is ultimately just, it makes you, okay, fine, you're nice, but you're naive. And because utopianism is impossible. And they're constantly frustrated that the utopian reality isn't theirs, however they define it to be. This is the other problem. Without
Yes.
really strong principles in place, what you define as utopia could just be anything. And like, I'm
Yes.
not clear on what grounding, like foundation they have to define what utopia is. So that's like a whole separate issue.
Yes.
But the thing about
Yes.
striving for utopianism is like they're willing to just burn down foundations because they can't reach that utopian level that they
That's
want.
exactly right.
And you end up just getting lower and lower. And we try to convince
That's
them
right.
of that so that they'll stop.
Yes. Yes. Yes, that's right, Dan. Think about communism gets its start in the mid-19th century with the Industrial Revolution, Marx and Engels. I mean, you could argue that the early communists, they are genuinely deeply disturbed by the negative effects of industrialization, and they see an unjust social order. I understand that. But what's their solution? Eliminate private property. Somehow that's going to solve all society's problems. If we eliminate private property, somehow that'll change human nature. So I think there's a bad anthropology at work, if I could use that word, a view of a human person, a bad anthropology at work on the left, particularly on the left. If we just get rid of private property, people's whole way of interacting will just change and become what? Almost angelic.
Yeah.
And we'll create a sort of perfect egalitarian society. That's just not how life is, right? There's a reason we've been protecting private property rights in the West for about 5,000 years, more or less.
Yeah, and I think conservatives are just more comfortable with the notion that like this is about as good as you can get it as far as a system is concerned. It doesn't take away human nature. Human nature can go bad, it can go good, and you have to accept that as it is, and build a system that is best conducive to the outcomes you want of prosperity and freedom and equality. Those outcomes you need to define ahead of time. Again, like in our founding documents, I think they're defined ahead of time. And I think that's like the fundamental drawback of the left. And so, my conclusion is always, I'm glad they're around, because sometimes the liberals are just, they're good at pointing out things, maybe some injustices here and there that could be fixed.
Yes.
And that's okay. Like that's a kind-hearted thing that I'm glad they're around for, but I don't think they should ever be in charge of actually fixing it. because they're just not properly governed by limiting principles. And it's just like such a big deal. And it's why I explain to people, like, why be a conservative? And for me, it's like it's a thought process. It does lead to certain outcomes that we've all kind of all ended up agreeing on, but more important than anything, it's a thought process. And so now we get into the conversation about the populist right. To me, they have how do they fight against these Lockean principles? Because it's not the same as the left. They're not egalitarians. They're just really mad oftentimes. And I'm not so sure it goes a lot deeper than that, but they're also utopianists. Like they have this sort of idea in their head about how things should be. And I guess the way they do start to look a lot like the left is coercing the state to make that utopia theirs. But what do you observe?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary, Dan. If I had to maybe use a phrase, they're embittered utopians, if I could borrow from you on that. I think they're embittered utopians. And we've seen this before in a not so distant history. This is really, in many ways, the story of the 20th century, the early first half of the 20th century. What happens after the First World War, Dan? A lot of embittered people. The watchword of the hour is disillusionment. We fought this war, industrialized carnage. What do we have to show for it? Nothing. Wrecked economies, empires destroyed, millions of people unemployed. Why do you think fascism begins in Italy, which was on the winning side of the war in 1919, Benito Mussolini? They're on the winning side of the war. Incredible disillusionment. The problem with disillusionment is it sets you up for what? The demagogue, the utopian alternative. And that's what takes flight in the 1920s and 30s. Eugenics, communism, fascism, Nazism, all born out of a kind of disillusionment and anger. So I am deeply concerned about where the right is today in America. They are embittered utopians. And what are they doing? They're doing a very similar thing that these ideologies were doing in the 1920s and 30s, reach for the state. The state will help bring about this utopian vision we've got. Well, we've been down this road. We've seen this movie play out before, haven't we, Dan?
Yeah, no, it's literally what conservatives are supposed to be against. And look, it's a mixed bag. Some are, some aren't. It's politics is complicated, and you can choose a politician at will. And in some ways they're I think consistent conservatives, and in other ways I'm like, how on earth do you believe that? And so and there isn't the thing about the populists. It's like, it literally is just what's more popular at the time. I mean, that's why we call it populism. And so for me, the left has always been a populist ideology because they're like, hey, what do you want? You want more freer healthcare? Then let's just give you freer healthcare. Just elect me and I'll just give it to you. Like, I'll just give you more benefits. That's just elect me. What do you want? Like, because if I do a poll of the people and I say, do you, yes or no, do you want $1,000 from the government? What do you think that poll is going to say? Like, it's going to be a pretty high poll. So according to populism and direct democracy, that's what I should just do.
Yes.
But I don't because I'm a conservative with limiting principles. And yet, our populists, I'll never forget. It was the 2020 election.
Yes. And Dan, let me add this to the equation as well. I'll add this to the equation in terms of a flaw on the left, and we'll see how it connects to the right. A deep materialism, seeing people as they wouldn't use this language, but as commodities. This is the great Marxist era. If you view people only as physical beings, there's nothing beyond them, no transcendence, no spiritual dimension, then what's going to happen? You're not going to place the proper value on the family and all that does to ennoble and to dignify. You're not going to place the proper value on work, which does much to ennoble and dignify people, because we're not just material things who have to have our material needs satisfied. There are deeper emotional and spiritual needs we all have, made in the image of a creator if you're a person of faith. So the left has jettisoned that, as we know, become increasingly secular, and the Democratic Party increasingly secular progressive movement. So what about on the right? Because a lot of these guys on the right would certainly claim it's different.
Yeah.
It's different.
Because they would claim they're like they're on their profile pics, it's like whatever, Psalms this, Proverbs this. I mean, they're like, they really wear it on their sleeve. So
that's right. It's wrapped in religious stuff, but I think they've forgotten something really important out of their own religious traditions, which is this, at least one thing they've forgotten. You have got to transmit this great cultural inheritance we have, the political ideals, political liberalism, dignity. You got to transmit that through education. And the impatience and the cynicism of the hard right, it stuns me, Dan. I spent a couple of years recently here at the Heritage Foundation. That's another discussion for another day. I think they have many there, not everybody, but some have fallen into this trap over there, forgetting the incredibly important role of transmitting that Western heritage to the next generation through education. You're not going to solve deep cultural problems with an election cycle. It's not going to happen, right? And the right has almost forgotten that. What would you say?
Yeah, well, it's worse than that. So that it is true, you're not going to solve it through an election cycle. You need consistency if you're going to win the trust of voters. So that's true. But so my observation of what I call the populist right, I don't know what else to call it. They call themselves that. Nat Cons is another one, national conservatives. So they're America first.
Yeah, sure.
As if the rest of us aren't. It's a weird, and all that really boils down to generally is don't do anything with foreign policy. That's what they tend to mean by America first. So it's kind of a shallow view. And, I'm like, it's not America first when like everybody else controls the world's sea lanes and all politics around the world. That's not America first. That means we're going to be last every single time because we get last at the table. But, it's a foreign policy discussion for a different time. I think what really binds the philosophy that I'm worried about is really just grievance and victimhood. So this is another place where like the left and the far left and far right meet like really, really well, and they lock arms. Is this sense of victimhood, victim from the government, victim from other social classes. Now they choose different social classes to be mad at. Don't get me wrong, right? It's definitely boils down to this ideology where you're no longer in charge, where like you really don't have the agency that conservatives were always so proud of. Like, no, it's like, let's quote my friend Jocko, right? It's like extreme ownership, like you own everything. That's a very conservative mindset. It's a very SEAL mindset, of course, because we like to do everything to the extreme. And so he's talking about it in leadership terms, but it's meaningful when we talk about it in individual terms too, because like, look, maybe you are truly victimized, but in the end, your mentality to be able to get out of that is important. And if you could just continue to believe you're a victim, then you're going to be looking for the demagogue to save you.
Exactly.
And that's not a conservative value.
Right. That's exactly right. And again, there's a historical pattern here, it seems to me a bit, if we could say that, Dan, looking to the demagogue to solve deep cultural problems. How did we get there? I understand the issue of grievance in the sense of being on the outside, being put down, being treated like garbage from the elite institutions. I've got some years on you, Dan, so I can remember a time when not all the institutions in America, the popular media, of course, the academic institutions, etc., even the business community. I can remember a time when they were not all kind of amassed against a more kind of traditional conservative view of the world, where you were not quite treated with contempt in the way that conservatives can be. I understand that. I get that grievance. But then you got to ask yourself the question, all right, how did we get there? How did we get there, and what can we do about it? Rationally, what can we do about it? And that's why, as an educator, of course, I'm going to emphasize you have got to train the next generation up in this great cultural inheritance that we have. In my class the other day with some of my students, I made reference to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Glazed look on their face. These are college students now at a good institution. Had never heard of the Lincoln-Douglas debate. So we have a lot of work to do. That's a generational task, and that takes patience. Grievance will not get you there, right?
No, it won't. And it's just emotion. I mean, people want to be mad, and social media gives them an outlet for that, like it never has before. And so I think people also feel angrier. They feel more divided, even though whether it's true or not is it's it's hard to measure. But somebody rightfully pointed out that only God can really have the emotional capacity to deal with omniscience, and none of us really do. And the internet kind of gives us this sort of this omniscience, but then you add to that the reality of negativity bias, where our brains are drawn to negativity. I know mine is, right? Like a million good things happen to me, but it's 10 bad things. It's like you're just down. And so it's making people just really upset, and they're looking for that outlet. And the world, here's another, I think, new thing in politics, or society really, is it's just more complicated. The founders were living in an era where policy was just not that complicated. And so I think sometimes too, we bemoan some of the policies that are in place, and don't really look to why those policies are in place or why we're doing things the way we do it. Maybe we should change them, maybe we shouldn't. But there's oftentimes no sense of humility about like what someone doesn't know or not know. And we live in a really complex place. The founders didn't have the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid to deal with. They didn't have these massive bureaucracies. They didn't have to figure out how to do regulatory regimes on spectrum control and HF and who does what, and radio frequencies, and laying down the fiber optic cables, and building the space satellites. There's just a lot, and so it's really easy too for demagogues, especially on the outside of the kind of the media world, to just say things with some authority because they've got a high listenership and they're very entertaining people, and people just believe it. And I'm like, this week, for instance, we had some debates on FISA, and to me, that's an example of a belief in something that isn't true, where like the Jerry Nadler's bill, who's a far left Democrat, somehow made it into my friends on the Freedom Caucus's hands, and they're loving it, and I'm like, but you're going to dismantle our entire security apparatus, and they're just like, no, we're not. We don't believe you, and I'm like, I mean, we're just disagreeing on basic facts at this point, and it's a frustrating debate to have. But it's happening.
Yes, and Dan, to your point, the more that emotions, and anger, and rage become just part of in the air and in the water, in the ether, well, then what happens to rational thinking? I mean, rational, calm, clear, logical analysis. If that goes out the window, we are in deep trouble. There's a line from C.S. Lewis where he says, the great Christian author, nonsense in the intellect draws evil after it. Nonsense in the intellect draws evil after it. And Lewis was so good on coming back to think it out, man. Think out what you're saying. And in the Screwtape Letters, that wonderful diabolical fantasy, the Screwtape Letters, these demons tempting the mortal. One of the things that comes up is, don't let your mortal man start thinking rationally. Don't let him go through logic. Who knows where that will take him, right? So the denigration of just good, clear, critical, rational thinking, caring about facts, that is a huge problem for this republic right now, Dan. And I'm not sure what we do about it, but we've got to keep pushing back with truth. We've got to keep standing up making hard choices, saying hard truths in a way that can be received, not in an angry, burn the house down kind of way, but we got to bring some truths to bear, facts to bear on the situation, which is the kind of thing you do. Thank you.
I try, and a wise mentor of mine told me, look, good leadership is delivering the truth to people at a rate that they can handle. And and I've seen some politicians crash and burn because they're like, screw you, this is what it is, and it's you got to choose your battles, because if you don't live to fight another day, you're just out of the fight.
Yes.
And what I worry about on the Republican side, we were talking about, kind of the obsession with just winning the next election, and I'm actually not so sure we're obsessed with winning the next election. I think
I agree.
that's actually the scary
Obsessed
part.
with something else. Yeah.
Let's say I've said it openly, like if Trump's, I didn't participate in the primary, in this presidential primary at all, and I still won't. But when, and I think it is a when, Trump is the nominee, look, I'm going to advocate for him over Biden. It's simple as that. But I'm not so sure some in our party want to win. I think there will be generally unification around Trump to a large extent, but I mean more winning the general battle. I see Democrats in their current form as the easiest party in history to beat. If we just stick to sort of Reagan conservatism, you're sticking to the basics, you're maintaining your principles, you're not jumping to positions that are clearly contradictory to your own principles. You're nice about it, right? You're very conservative, but you're not angry about it. And that is an easy to win doctrine, if you will. And I just keep and we have that debate in our own conference sometimes, right? I remember when McCarthy was still here. It's like you've got to still win, guys, and there would be members who would actually stand up who were like, no, there's value in losing. I mean, if that's what it takes. And I'm like, there's literally none. There's no value in that, in losing, this seat or that seat. If the goal is winning on policy. Now it's easy. I'm not so sure that's their goal. And we're going to have this fight right now.
Yes.
Because we're debating whether we want to actually get some wins on a supplemental or not.
Yes.
And I don't know.
Dan, don't we have to ask ourselves the question, and maybe I'll put the question to you, since you've been putting questions to me. The founders, if you think about it, they could produce leaders who were world-class leaders. They could produce dozens of them in that founding generation, really, men and women eventually, who could stand up and lead. Amazing caliber of leadership. We can't produce men and women of that caliber now, hardly you can count them on one hand, if you can find the one hand to count them. So the question I have, that a lot of people have, is, well, how is it that in political terms, how is it that the parties have produced these men as the head of the party, as the head of their movements? Is this the best that we can do? Everyone I know wants to say, no, it can't be the best that we can do. We have to do better, but we're not doing better. So the huge, important cultural question, Dan, is why? Why is the best that we have right now? Why? What would you say?
I'd say the simple answer is because, people don't put enough importance on primary elections. And so, if you don't like your choices, for whether it's in the president's race or whether it's in your local congressional race, if you're looking at your choices and you're like, how the hell is this my choice? Well, you got to ask yourself, did you vote in the primary? And did you try to get 20 friends to vote in the primary? And the answer is usually not, So I'm mostly talking about my kind of, I wouldn't call them moderate Republicans, but call them inactive Republicans. They know they'll vote in a general election. Like, we're going to go support the Republican. Got it. Yeah. But our voter turnout in primaries is very, very slim. Now, sometimes it works out okay. Sometimes it doesn't. We could go across the different districts in America and look at them. You could have an R30 district where you got a crazy person representing it, or you can have an R30 district where you've got a really good, solid governing Republican that really wants to solve problems and understands that solving those problems is messy and you're going to piss people off, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And I think part of right-wing populism is a refusal to believe that fact, and it is a fact that if you want wins, policy wins, you do have to have the right people win elections and have sustained majorities. And to have sustained
Yes.
majorities, you have to be persuasive. And to be persuasive, you can't
Yes.
just be yelling and screaming shit and being angry all the time.
Right.
Like
Right.
you have to you have to stop and take a breath and think through some of this stuff. So, it's not really
Yes.
a problem in our system. I think it's a problem with, how easy it is to get people to believe certain things, because of social media and that being a primary location where people might derive their news from, but also just lack of
Yes.
participation by those who are honestly maybe more level-headed. But when you're, just psychologically, the more level-headed
Yes.
people in America, you might call them
Yes.
moderates. I'm not so sure they're necessarily moderates. But they're also not as passionate, right? They're not going to Republican or Democrat Party meetings. Those, they're
Right.
not. And we need a better mix of I think participation from our own voters to actually fix some of those problems. If you don't
Yes.
like your choices, that's what you got to do.
Yes. I'm with you most of the way on this, Dan. I guess the question I'm still wrestling with as an historian, of course, and as a voter and a participant, is where the populace is now. If they're so uneducated about the nature of our system, our Republican system, our federal system, the states have authority, the federal, if they're so ignorant of that, it seems to me they're just so much more vulnerable to the demagogue. And that's a left-right problem. It's not just a right problem or a left problem. If we don't understand the nature of our system and what it was designed to do, what does it mean to be self-governing citizens? You got to be able to govern yourself at the end of the day. And if you, right?
Yeah, you got to have a civics education. I've actually just finished, I'm also working on them, but like 7 or 8 lectures on Civics 101. And I'm excited. I'm working with Jordan Peterson on that. And I'm excited to do it. And, it's mostly, I think it'll be great. I mean, because I want people to understand that, what a congressman does and what they don't do, right? And like there's and what separation of powers actually means, well, you had control of the Senate, House, and the presidency. Why didn't you do this? Well, because there's a 60 vote threshold in the Senate for cloture, and there's just some basic stuff. And also, well, why don't you do this? Well, it's not really a federal thing. You don't want us doing that. It's
right.
You got to be careful what you ask for.
Right.
Because the shoe on the other foot question has to be asked. And so, so that's not a satisfying answer to a lot of people who are angry and want something to change. And you just have to remind them, I'm like, somebody will often say, well, this is what the people want. And I'm like, well, it's what you want. And I'm sure there's a lot who agree with you, but if the people wanted it, you'd probably get it. The reality is that some things a lot of people disagree with you more than you realize. Because we all kind of associate within our bubbles, and then we get this sort of confirmation bias about what we believe, and I think it's human nature.
Yes, Dan, I'm delighted to hear you're doing a civics thing here with Jordan Peterson, because you could hardly do anything more important to that in this political moment, I think. And this goes back to the Greeks. In ancient Greece and Athens, if you didn't participate, you're a citizen. If you didn't show up in the assembly and vote and engage in civic and political life, they had a word for you. And the word was idiotai. Idiotai, idiot. You were an idiot. You weren't fulfilling your civic responsibility to the city-state. You had to be engaged. The Romans had a similar idea as well, with the word pietas, duty, devotion to duty, devotion to country, right? It's right out of Virgil.
I like that word a little bit better than idiot, but yeah. But it is, it's a civic duty. I'm going to incorporate some of the things you said on this podcast into my lectures, because I'm not a Western or civilization expert by any stretch, but in the first of my lectures, what I basically explore is why do we even have a government? And try to just map that out. Like, well, because we need to organize ourselves. Okay, well, how should we organize ourselves? I don't know. It's like, let's have a leader. Okay, well, we got a leader. Now what? Okay, well, that didn't work out so well. And like, how many people can you really have a leader under? How many people can be governed by one person? How is, the complexities of society. So it's like exploring all of these interesting questions. And I think helps people get to like, okay, this is how we got to where we are, with a local, a state, and a federal government. And of course, we argue about where those powers have been overstepped. And of course, as a conservative, we think there's been massively overstepped on the federal side, but we fight that. And that's the purpose of
and think
politics.
about it, Dan. Another way to put this, if I could, is we're kind of at a Hobbes versus Locke moment, it seems to me, in our political culture. Thomas Hobbes, the Leviathan, give me a powerful ruler over the whole Commonwealth. He'll tell me what to do, but he'll provide stability and order, right? And maybe prosperity. Give me that powerful ruler, the Leviathan. That's Hobbes. Then there's Locke. Give me self-government. Give me government by consent of the governed, which a whole different view of the human person, our obligations, not just our rights and responsibilities, rights, but our obligations and responsibilities, right? Hobbes versus Locke. And it seems to me we're at a Hobbesian, Lockean moment right now. And it's anybody's guess which way the country's going to go.
We've probably been there for a long time. I mean, how long have we put basically every ounce of effort into whoever the president is? I mean, we've definitely gotten to a point in our society where we view the president as this all powerful king. Everything is the president's fault, and everything good that happens is the president's fault. You know, the stock market goes up, it's the president. Stock market goes down, it's the president. It's like, well, stop imbuing so much power in this person. Now, Congress has imbued too much power in that person by simply abdicating that authority. I'm not sure. What do you think? Here's a question. What do you think our founders envisioned? Like, if they were to look, if they were like if you were to ask them about 2024, would they have envisioned the factions that we have now being so clearly divided in a left and right spectrum and a Republican Democrat kind of spectrum?
I think Madison might have. I think a guy like Madison might have. He really deeply worried about factions and the potential for factions to really tear the Republic apart.
Well, but I mean like a two-party system, basically. Do you think they ever imagined that, or do you think they imagined a lot more parties, or do you think they imagined more like regional differences able to combat each other?
That's a terrific question. You can
or not combat, but balance.
Yeah. I think probably depending on the founder you're talking to, you're going to get a slightly different answer. I think they really hope that after going through the fires of the Revolutionary War with this now united country and this Constitution and the two chambers, the Senate and the House, and a president who was not a king, who limited himself to 2 terms, and it wasn't even in the Constitution from the get-go. You don't have to put it in the Constitution. George Washington set the example, 2 terms. I think they were really hopeful that we'd be able to manage these differences and that you prevent the whole kind of factions taking over with such a large country and so many different communities, so many different constituencies. They'd have to compromise. And think about this, Dan. The compromises they managed at the convention were truly remarkable. And I understand the issue of slavery and that unfortunate deep compromise with that deep sin. I understand that. But they made other compromises which were terrific, which held the Union together, which they didn't have to make and might not have made. And that's everything from the 2 chambers, the federal system, the separation of powers. I mean, these were immense breakthroughs in political theory under pressure and in a hot summer in Philadelphia without air conditioning. Not bad, right?
Yeah. And you know, I think, and I put this in one of my lectures too, I actually do believe that with the benefit of some hindsight, that it was certainly inevitable that we would have a left and a right faction the way we do.
Yeah.
And I believe that because I think every country has that. Now, they might have different, parties, more parties than we do that are viable, but in the end, they have a coalition government and an opposition government. In the end, it's always, and it's often in this sort of conservative liberal divide. And I think that's natural to the human condition. I point to, Thomas Sowell's book, Conflict of Visions, as like the best book on this subject about like how the human mind is just divided into this, on the one side, basically a desire to have government have just more control and develop that utopianism. And on the other side, what he calls the constrained vision, a constrained view of government that just allows for a little bit more risk and human nature, but does its best to create a system where it doesn't completely fall apart. And like, for all of the hand wringing we have about our America these days, it's like, it hasn't fallen apart. Like, our economy is still at like a great height. Things aren't that bad. I always worth telling people who are angry, I'm like, get off the internet for 30 days, please. Just go out into your community and hang out with people. And you're going to be like, all right, maybe America's not so bad. Because it's not. It's just not. Like, we got bad things happening. We got bad trends in universities and things, but it's also not all universities. It's
That's
highly
right.
concentrated in elite coastal universities. There's context that I think we in the effort to hyperbolize things in order to make a point, which I get as a politician, I get the affinity to do that.
Yes,
You still got to contextualize things so you don't piss people off too much, because then they'll
that's
want
right.
things that you didn't intend for them to want.
That's
So,
right. That's right, man. If we can't just keep catastrophizing everything, and that satisfies some emotional need, I think, for a lot of people to catastrophize, but we just can't keep going down that road. It doesn't lead to constructive solutions to the problems we really have. And we can solve so many of these problems with some good, clear, hard thinking, honest thinking, facing the facts. Try to reach across the aisle once in a while. There are people across the aisle who are sane, and we've just so vilified each other. And that's a recipe for disaster. We got to get off the vilification bandwagon, don't we?
yeah, it's more of a problem on the right, right? Because we have labels for it, or rhino, or if you try to work with Democrats on something, it's the uniparty. And
Yeah.
I'm like,
Yeah.
what does that even mean, man?
Yeah. What does it
Uh,
mean? Right.
you're writing a book, or you're about to come out with a book on Token and Lewis.
I
Is
am
it out
actually,
yet?
yes.
Okay.
It's called the War for Middle Earth. J.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis confront the gathering storm, 1933 to 1945. Thanks for mentioning it, Dan. It's
Yes.
a deeply
What's that
encouraging
about?
story. Well, these guys, they have a ringside seat to the rise of these ideologies in the 1930s. Tolkien and Lewis do in Great Britain: fascism, communism, totalitarianism. And what do these guys do? Well, Britain's going to be at war, struggling for its existence. But it's at that precise moment, 1939 to 1945, well, Tolkien and Lewis are getting on with their callings. They're not politicians, they're academics and writers. So what are they doing, Dan? They're writing their great epic works with all the uncertainty that's going on in the world. And it's not even clear Great Britain's going to survive. They're getting on with their works, and think about their stories, Dan. They're not dystopian, cynical stories of anger and rage. They're drawing our hearts and minds to the true, the good, the beautiful.
Mhm.
They're creating a vision of a world as it ought to be. So there's a hopefulness and a moral beauty embedded in their stories. Think about it, Dan, during one of the most darkest period, really, of human civilization, 1939 to 1945. And they're not going to allow that emotional mood and gloom to overwhelm them. They're going to push back. It's a great story.
Yeah. Well, we'll look forward to it coming out. They're pulling me out because I got to go talk to CNN, I guess.
Okay.
So I'm sure we could talk forever. And I appreciate you being on. This has been a great conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks so much. Great being with you.
I appreciate it.